America's most decorated soldier of World War II, Audie Murphy. On a wooded mountain near Roanoke, Virginia this afternoon, rescue workers found 6 bodies and no survivors in the remains of a private plane the 46-year-old Murphy and a group of businessmen had taken in a flight from Atlanta, Georgia last Friday.
For more than 50 years, one story has been carved into American history. It's the tragic final chapter for a man whose heroism was almost unbelievable. Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of World War II, a man who stared down the German army and died in a simple plane crash. Just a horrible accident, a twist of fate on a foggy mountain in Virginia. That was the official story. That was the easy answer. But what if that official report, the one that blamed bad weather and pilot error, isn't the whole story? What if the neat and tidy explanation we've been fed for decades was really just a cover for a far more disturbing truth? For years, whispers of conspiracy have haunted that day, theories about foul play, about a hero being silenced. But the truth, hidden for decades in faded government files and court records, is finally coming out. And the answer isn't some grand conspiracy. It's a heartbreaking look at what really happened up on that mountain. And it's far worse and far more infuriating than we were ever led to believe. Because the real mystery isn't if someone was responsible, the mystery is how they were ever allowed to be . To really get the tragedy of what happened on May 28, 1971, you have to understand the man, not just the legend, but the man himself. Audie Leon Murphy was born into the dirt-poor life of a sharecropper in Hunt County, Texas. Growing up in the Great Depression and orphaned at 16, he was an undersized, quiet kid who seemed destined for a life of struggle. When the war started, he had to lie about his age just to enlist. The Marines and paratroopers turned him down for being too small. But the Army finally took him, maybe seeing something in him others missed: a quiet fire, a toughness forged in hardship. That quiet fire would set the battlefields of Europe ablaze. Over 400 days on the front lines, he became a legend. In Sicily, Italy, Anzio, France, he fought with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. The stories sound like myths, but they're true. And then came the moment that made him immortal. On January 26, 1945, near Holtzweiler, France, his company was getting torn to shreds. They were about to be overrun by 6 German panzer tanks and waves of soldiers. Wounded and out of ammo, Murphy ordered his men to fall back to the woods while he stayed. He then climbed onto a burning, abandoned M10 tank destroyer, which could have exploded at any second, and used its .50 caliber machine gun to single-handedly fight off the entire German attack for over an hour. He killed dozens of enemy soldiers, even calling in artillery strikes on his own position, refusing to give up an inch of ground until the Germans were forced to retreat. For that, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, just one of 28 medals he'd received from the US, France, and Belgium. He came home a national hero, an icon. His face was on the cover of Life magazine. Hollywood came knocking, and he became a movie star, appearing in over 40 films, and most famously playing himself in his own autobiography, To Hell and Back. On the outside, it looked like the American dream come true. That's what makes the official story of his death so brutally ordinary. On the morning of May 28, 1971, a 45-year-old Audie Murphy boarded a private twin-engine Aero Commander 680 in Atlanta. He was a passenger on a business trip to Martinsville, Virginia, along with 5 other people, including the pilot, Herman Butler. The flight took off at 9:10 a.m. under what's called Visual Flight Rules, or VFR. That means exactly what it sounds like. The pilot flies by sight, needing a clear view of the ground to navigate. The pilot, Butler, got a weather briefing before they left, but he chose not to file an official flight plan. Around 11:49 a.m., Butler radioed the FAA in Roanoke, Virginia. He didn't give his position, but he got an updated weather report, and it was bad. The weather was getting worse, fast. The report mentioned a ceiling 1,000 feet broken, 2,500 feet overcast, visibility 3 miles in light rain and fog, with mountain ridges obscured. For a VFR pilot, mountain ridges obscured is one of the most terrifying things you can hear. Butler acknowledged the report, said he was going to try and land at Roanoke, and was given the local altimeter setting. That was the last anyone heard from the plane. At 12:08 p.m., the plane slammed into the side of Brush Mountain, about 14 miles from Roanoke. It hit the trees at the 2,700-foot level, flying fast and level. The pilot had no idea the mountain was right in front of him. The crash and fire destroyed the plane and killed everyone on board because of the remote location and the same bad weather that caused the crash. It took 3 days to find the wreckage. When the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, investigated, their conclusion was quick and simple. Their final report in 1972 stated the probable cause was the pilot's choice to keep flying under visual rules. Into instrument conditions, in other words, flying blind into the clouds. The report said the pilot tried to fly in, whether he wasn't qualified for, at an altitude too low to clear the mountains. In the cold language of aviation, it was pilot error, a tragic, but simple, accident. Case closed. For most people, that was the end of it. A hero's life cut short by a simple mistake. But for those who looked a little closer, including Audie's own family, the official story never quite felt right. On the surface, it's straightforward, but when you start pulling at the threads, the narrative starts to unravel, and you're left with a lot of troubling questions. The official report never really answered. First, there's the flight path. Why was the plane even there? Experienced pilots who knew the area called that route through the Roanoke Valley suicidal in those conditions. With the mountains hidden by fog and rain, flying low enough to stay out of the clouds meant flying into a deadly trap of rock and trees. There were safer routes. So why did the pilot, Herman Butler, choose that one? The official report mentions his decision, but doesn't really dig into what a stunningly bad call it was. It's one thing to make a mistake. It's another to fly straight into a situation any other pilot would call reckless. Then there's the 3-day search. The plane vanished, but it took a painfully long time to find it. Sure, technology in the 70s wasn't what it is today, and the weather didn't help. But that long delay created an information vacuum where anything seemed possible. Rumors started to fly. Was the delay on purpose? Was something being hidden, or maybe removed from the crash site before it was officially found? They were just whispers at first, but with no answers, they got louder. The questions then turned to the people on the plane. Audie Murphy wasn't on a joyride, he was on a business trip, chasing a potential investment. In the years after the war, despite his movie star fame, Audie's life was a mess. He struggled with what we now call PTSD. Back then, they just called it shell shock. He had chronic insomnia, depression, and slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He once said that the Army rehabilitated its war dogs, but did nothing. For the soldiers, on top of all that, he was in serious financial trouble. He'd made and lost fortunes, was a compulsive gambler, and had declared bankruptcy just a few years earlier in 1968. He was constantly chasing deals, trying to find a way to pay his debts and support his family. This trip wasn't for fun. It was a lifeline. He was traveling with business associates connected to a company where he was a director. This is important context. Audie was in a vulnerable spot, financially and emotionally, and he was dealing with people in the high-stakes world of private investments, a world that doesn't always play by the rules. And that leads us to the biggest crack in the whole story, the pilot, Herman Butler. The NTSB report makes him out to be a guy who just made a bad decision. But who was he really? On paper, he had over 8,000 hours of flight time, which sounds impressive. But in aviation, the details are everything. How many of those hours were in this specific plane, the Aero Commander 680, and, most importantly, was he actually certified to fly in the exact conditions that killed everyone? The initial reports were fuzzy on this, leaving a huge hole in the story. The official narrative depends on the idea that a competent pilot made one fatal error. But what if that wasn't true? What if the man at the controls never should have been flying that plane to begin with? These problems, the dangerous route, the delayed discovery, Murphy's desperation, and the big question marks around the pilot's real qualifications created the perfect storm for suspicion. It felt like key pieces of the puzzle were missing. The story of a simple accident started to feel less like a conclusion and more like a convenient story. When a hero dies under a cloud of doubt, speculation rushes in to fill the void. For Audie Murphy, that speculation spiraled into a world of conspiracy theories that have lasted for 50 years. These weren't just random fantasies. They were stories built on the cracks in the official report, trying to make sense of something that didn't add up. The most popular theory has always involved the mafia. This theory suggests that Murphy, buried in gambling debts, got on the wrong side of organized crime. People point to his financial desperation as the motive. They argue that Audie, a man known for his rigid code of honor, either refused to play ball in some shady scheme or just couldn't pay what he owed. In this version, the plane crash was no accident. It was a hit, designed to look like a tragedy. This theory seems more plausible when you consider the world Murphy was moving in. His desperate search for money had led him into some murky business circles. While there's no hard evidence linking him to the mob, the world of high-risk investments back then often overlapped with some very shady characters. To a lot of people, it wasn't a huge leap to imagine America's greatest war hero getting tangled in a web. He couldn't escape. The next theory is even darker. A government cover-up. This one claims that Audie Murphy, through his Hollywood and business connections, had stumbled onto secrets he wasn't supposed to know, maybe about covert operations, political scandals, or illegal CIA activities. Some accounts claim that in the weeks before he died, Murphy had become paranoid, convinced he was being followed. This theory suggests he was seen as a threat, a man with too much integrity who couldn't be controlled. If he went public with what he knew, his heroic reputation would make him impossible to discredit. So, the only way to silence him was to eliminate him. The plane crash, in this scenario, was a state-sponsored hit. perfectly disguised by bad weather and so-called pilot error. A third theory is less dramatic but just as ugly: insurance fraud. Murphy was a director of the company that owned the plane. Could the crash have been set up by a business partner to collect on a huge insurance policy? Was Murphy the unknowing target in a scheme to profit from his death? This theory isn't about spies and mobsters. It's about cold, hard greed. It suggests the very people Murphy trusted in business might have decided he was worth more dead than alive. These theories took hold for one simple reason: they felt more fitting than the official story. It just didn't seem right that a man who survived the hell of World War II could be killed by a simple, preventable mistake. The conspiracies gave him a villain worthy of his legend. They painted him as a man still fighting a war, this time in the shadows. For decades, these whispers were the only alternative, but what no one realized was that the proof was there all along, not in some top-secret file, but in the public record. And the truth it revealed wasn't a conspiracy, but something far more common, and in its own way, far more tragic. For decades, the story of Audie Murphy's death was a tug-of-war between two ideas: a simple accident or a deep conspiracy. But the truth is rarely that dramatic. The newly uncovered evidence here isn't some declassified document or a secret agent's confession. It's information that's been sitting in plain sight for 50 years, buried in dense government reports and dry court filings. And when you piece it all together, you don't find a conspiracy. You find a staggering, almost criminal level of negligence. The story isn't about who wanted Audie Murphy dead. It's about how a chain of failures made his death almost certain. The heart of it all comes down to the pilot, Herman Lavelle Butler. The NTSB report blamed pilot error, yes, but it's the details in that report and the facts that came out in the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Murphy's family that are truly damning. Let's start with the single most important fact. Herman Butler, the man flying a complex plane into a mountain in zero visibility, was not penetrated. This is the smoking gun. An instrument rating is a special certification a pilot earns that proves they can fly the plane using only the cockpit instruments, without seeing a thing outside. It is the most critical qualification for flying in clouds or fog. Flying into what the NTSB called instrument meteorological conditions without that rating isn't just a mistake. It's a direct violation of federal aviation law. It's like someone who's only ever driven a car in daylight trying to drive a semi-truck at midnight in a blizzard with no headlights. The NTSB report says it plainly. The pilot tried to fly in weather for which he was not properly certificated. But it gets so much worse. While Butler had 8,000 flight hours, records show his experience in that specific plane, the Aero Commander 680, was dangerously lonesome. Reports suggest as little as 6 hours. That plane was a high-performance machine. 6 hours is barely enough time to get used to the controls, let alone master it in an emergency. This wasn't a one-time bad decision for Butler. It was a pattern. Just a year before the crash that killed Audie Murphy, Butler had crashed another plane. The cause: he ran out of fuel. In what seems like a terrifying dress rehearsal, he had tried to make an emergency landing on a highway before he stalled the plane and crashed into the trees. So here's the situation. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy was a passenger in a complex airplane, flown by a pilot who wasn't certified for the weather, had almost no experience in that specific aircraft, and had a documented history of crashing planes. But the negligence didn't stop with the pilot. It went all the way up to the company that owned the plane, Colorado Aviation, Inc. A civil lawsuit from Audie Murphy's family ended with a $2.5 million judgment against the plane's owner. Why? The court found them negligent. Evidence from the trial revealed that the operator's air taxi license had actually been suspended before the accident. The company that put that plane in the air wasn't even legally cleared to be running that kind of commercial flight. This is the heartbreaking truth that gets lost in the conspiracy theories. There was no need for a saboteur. There was no need for a government hit squad. The system just failed. A pilot who was unqualified and had a reckless history was put at the controls of a plane he barely knew by a company whose license was suspended and sent into weather that he had no business flying in. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing the plane that day circling low, lost in the clouds. At one point, the pilot even tried to land on a highway, the exact same desperate move from his last crash. This wasn't a man being lured into a trap. This was a man who was completely out of his league, lost in the fog, making one disastrous choice after another until he ran out of altitude. The mystery is solved, and the answer is not good. It's not a story of spies and assassins. It's a story of gross incompetence and a shocking disregard for safety. Audie Murphy wasn't assassinated. He was a victim of negligence. His death wasn't a dark plot. It was an entirely preventable tragedy. Knowing about the negligence solves the how, but it doesn't answer the deeper, more painful question. Why was Audie Murphy on that plane to begin with? The answer reveals the real tragedy of how America's greatest war hero was treated after the fighting was done, and how the country he helped save ultimately failed him. Audie Murphy didn't get on that flight for kicks. He was there because he was desperate. The hero who had faced down an army was now losing a battle with financial ruin. He had declared bankruptcy, his movie career was fading, and he was buried in gambling debts and unpaid taxes. This trip to Virginia was to check out a business deal for a company that made prefabricated homes. It was just one more attempt to get back on his feet. The fact that he was on that particular plane, with that pilot and that company, wasn't a coincidence. It was a symptom of his desperation. He likely took whatever ride was offered, no questions asked, because he felt he had no other choice. That financial pressure was a direct result of his invisible wounds. The war that made him a hero also broke something inside him. His PTSD came out not just in nightmares and insomnia, but in risky, impulsive behavior. His compulsive gambling was a well-known problem, a way to chase the adrenaline of combat in a peacetime world that felt empty. He was haunted by what he'd seen and done, but in an era when mental health was never talked about, Murphy did something incredible. He spoke up. He was one of the first and most famous advocates for the mental health of veterans. He fought to raise awareness about battle fatigue and demanded the government take better care of the soldiers it sent to war, and then forgot about he knew better than anyone that a soldier's war doesn't end when they come home. And that is the final, heartbreaking truth. The crash on Brush Mountain was the end of his life, but the tragedy had been building for 25 years. He survived the German army, only to be ambushed by the peace that followed. He was celebrated as a symbol, given parades and movie roles, but he was left to fight his demons all by himself. The country that pinned medals on his chest offered almost nothing for the scars on his soul. His death wasn't a conspiracy, and it wasn't just a simple accident. It was the final, tragic result of a hero being let down. Let down by a pilot who shouldn't have been flying. Let down by a company that put profits over safety. And on a much bigger scale, let down by a nation that knew how to make a hero, but had no idea how to take care of the man. The system failed him at every level. The negligence that put him on that plane is a small picture of the neglect he and countless other veterans faced trying to find peace after war. So, the Audie Murphy mystery is solved. The truth isn't a thriller about spies or mobsters. It's a much darker, sadder truth about human error, greed, and a nation's failure to protect one of its own. The final, terrible irony is that Audie Murphy, a man who risked everything to save the soldiers under his command, died because the people in charge of his safety showed none of that same care. His death wasn't an act of war, it was a casualty of the peace. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers our heroes face aren't on the battlefield, but in the quiet struggles they fight long after the guns go silent. If you found this investigation meaningful, please consider subscribing and sharing this story. It's important that stories like Audie's, in all their tragic complexity, are not forgotten. Let us know in the comments. What do you think is the most tragic part of this story?